Welcome to the Nouvel Esprit Podcast. We are your hosts, Guillermo Moreno.
Oh, you want me to say something?
Yes, your
That was
name.
your cue.
Hey, it's me, Jeremy Hosstotter.
Hey, Charles Maciati, good to see y'all.
Yep, and here we are for our third episode of the Nouvel Esprit Podcast. Just a brief overview of our last episode. We talked about the main catalyst for Nouvel Esprit, and we talked about the origins of radical traditionalism, how it spawned with the Society of St. Pius X, and we went into quite a bit of the history of that, as well as sharing our experiences with these individuals in terms of quote unquote, well, no, I wouldn't say quote unquote, in terms of our interactions, shall we say. And today's topic somewhat segues off of that insofar as we're addressing the philosophy called personalism. Now, the thing about personalism, it does consist of, I would describe phenomenological works and existentialism.
So, Guillermo,
Yes, Jeremy.
can you say phenomenology 5 times fast for us?
No, I cannot. I can try. But the reason why we're bringing up this topic is because it, I know to a great degree, it was influential to me in the works of Pope John Paul II, who was he was influential to the people who were influential to me, and I've read quite a few of his works, and it's breathtaking to say the least. But I would describe it as a particular approach that looks at the human person in a way that say something like metaphysics just can't quite grasp. And it's going to be a fruitful philosophy for our day and age. So today's objective is to describe or to define this philosophy, how or why it is true, and to explain why it's necessary for our goal here at Nouvel Esprit and for the new evangelization. We would like to start off by explaining that this personalist philosophy grew in contrast to certain ideologies. I would say as early as in the 20th century, but possibly earlier. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, phenomenology was a main driving force of personalism. Um, so if you wanted to identify personalism with phenomenology, then you would have to say it's a 20th century movement.
Mm-hmm.
However, I don't think you can strictly identify it as a 20th century philosophy, even though most of its thinkers are 20th century. For example, if one were to read the works of Kierkegaard, the famous 19th century Danish philosopher, you find a lot of personalist themes in Kierkegaard. But so you have Kierkegaard, whose concern was the human person, and in particular, his situation, his relationship with God, and the various situations man puts himself in. So the theme of the person is very present. It's right there in your face as he's doing his unique style philosophizing, this kind of existential approach. And
I'm sorry.
I would also say you could kind of see some kind of proto personalist themes and say Blaise Pascal and his Pensées. There are some very interesting comments he makes in there. One of my philosophy professors at Franciscan talked about how Or I guess I should say he made the claim that Pascal was really a proto-existentialist thinker.
To be clear, is he the same Pascal as in Pascal's wager?
Exactly.
Okay,
Pascal's wager actually comes from the Pensées.
the Ponces. Okay, great. Because part of the reason why I ask is because a, a lot of us just haven't quite heard of Soren Kierkegaard. I certainly hadn't. I technically have, but I don't know too much about him. And as I asked you a while back, who would you describe as the godfather of personalism, if anyone?
Well, that's an interesting question, Godfather Personalism, because the personalist thinkers that you properly call personalists are all Christian or all
Beautiful.
theistic. So if you really want to look for a godfather, I would say it would be Jesus Christ
Hmm.
because he is the inspiration. The Bible is the inspiration. Martin Buber was a Jewish philosopher, and he is somewhere on the phenomenological existential paradigm, but he's a deeply personalist thinker. You have Edith Stein, who was a Jew, became an atheist, converted to Catholicism through her encounters with the Carmelites and philosophy. It was the truths of the Catholic faith that prompted her to investigate her personalist views. Dietrich von Hildebrand, personalist, deeply devoted Catholic, he converted through the encounter of the lives of the saints. Just reading about the beauty of their lives was sufficient for him to see the truth of the Catholic faith and converted. Max Scheler is a little weird because he converted to Catholicism. Then 10 years later, he left. He ended up as a pantheist, but he still had a sort of theistic worldview that was in part motivated by theism of some sort. Emmanuel Mounier, right, began, who in a lot of ways began personalism with his book Personalism and his political movement, was like another Catholic motivated by his faith. Jacques Maritain, personalist, Catholic convert. Gabriel Marcel, existentialist thinker, also personalist. He was he converted to Catholicism, and what's interesting is he started out as an atheist, and the moment when he was about to commit suicide, he heard music, and the beauty of that music captivated him, and he said there has to be more.
Hmm. Marcel, you mean?
Yeah, Gabriel Marcel.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so and of course, we point to other thinkers current working in the personalist paradigm, like well, we had Karol Wojtyła, who became Pope John Paul II. His legacy as a personalist thinker, we're still unraveling. Currently, I would say Joseph Seifert, who's deeply influenced by Wojtyła and Dietrich von Hildebrand. You have Alice von Hildebrand, who just died recently,
Yeah.
the spouse of Dietrich von Hildebrand. John F. Crosby, the director of the Hildebrand Legacy Project, deeply committed to personalism. Still a very thriving movement today.
Yeah, I think I might add in if I could.
Oh yeah.
I think you're right that the origins are probably in Jesus Christ. However, I might argue that St. Paul was the very first in terms of writing something down that is an exploration of the way the human receives and responds to divine teaching or the law or something like this. And I'm reminded of Romans chapter 7, where there is this shift in language, because the book of Romans was really a letter to be read to churches in Rome. But there is a shift in Romans chapter 7 where Paul starts to speak to the I, right? So I know that sin leads to death. I feel the impact of sin. I am responding to the law. And so I think that perhaps one of the origins of personalism here is, maybe this is one of the very earliest instances of a person, a human that's wondering about divine things in light of the I, in light of the human person, and the way that we respond, right? Otherwise, I might argue that Pascal is, at least in the modern sense, one of the first, both existentialists and perhaps one of the first personalists who would then influence Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and these other folks, right?
Right.
So,
right. And I do like that you mentioned St. Paul, because I mean, you think about his meditations about human knowledge and God and sin in the book of Romans, and you do get this kind of extended analysis of the human person, even among his other works. There's like the famous chapter on love, for example, where I'm thinking of when he says, I do what I don't want to do, you know?
I find then that there's a law, right? The things I want to do, I don't do, and things
Exactly.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Another interesting and important, I would say, proto source for personalism would be St. Augustine.
Interesting.
Because if you read the works of Hildebrand, he has a lot of Augustinian influences. He read St. Augustine widely and refers to his works quite frequently.
Which I mean, we should also mention Pascal again one more time, if we can, because he was kind of an adherent of Janssen at Leuven, and Janssen was super into Augustine also, right?
Yeah.
So that thread is certainly there.
Yeah.
Excellent. Just something that I came across. I had read I believe his first name is Emmanuel and his last name is Burgos. He wrote a book called Introduction to Personalism.
Yeah,
And
Juan
if I'm
Manuel Burgos.
okay, yes, Juan,
Yeah.
yeah.
He's
And
a great guy.
you know, I am blessed to have read him in his original Spanish. And yeah, this is something that is necessary. I bring this up because, and I wish I could pinpoint where exactly he says so, that personalism uh, is the fruit that was born in light of these two opposing viewpoints, collectivism and individualism, but more specifically, fascism and Marxism. How they each go to a certain extremity in their view of the human person. What they lack is an integrated view of the human person, and that's what personalism seeks to address. And I know for me, it helps me to juxtapose something with its opposite. And there's these two polar opposites of fascism and Marxism. So how can we address personalism in light or despite these, not just these worldviews, but I would say movements and ideologies from which we could address so many other kinds of ideologies that inhibit our view of the human person in its integral, with integrity.
Right. So I think first of all, we should think about what is personalism itself, right? So we could say it's a philosophy of the human person, but what makes it personalism versus some other view of the person, right? So when we talk about personalism, there are certain fundamental presuppositions, namely that we understand the person to be a body soul unity.
Mm.
There's a corporeal principle to man, there's a incorporeal principle to man. And that body soul dualism, I guess we'd say man is a psychosomatic unity, you know, that body soul unity. That is something that can't be reduced to being pure spirit or being pure bodily. Man's not a material thing alone. He is not an angelic thing. He's not he's not a spirit with a juxtaposition of a body like Descartes held, that dual substance view of the human person. You have man as both an individual person with his very own special personal center of being, while also being a social being. Man is made for community. You have so personalism in a lot of ways is a synthesis, to use that nice Kierkegaardian term. You have
Thought that was a Hegelian term, Jeremy.
oh, it is. It's also Kierkegaardian. For Kierkegaard, man is a synthesis in that he is both physical, corporeal, and incorporeal. There's a finitude to him and an infinitude to him, right? Man has body, so he's determined. He has body, he's limited. There's only so many things a body can do, but there's a plenitude of being with a person because of the kind of being a person is. A person who loves, a person who enters into relationships with others in the world, with God, a person who can know truth, who can know goodness, who can know beauty. And that speaks of the heights to which man can roam, whether it's mathematics or simply the loving relationship between good friends. When we talk about the modern currents in philosophy, they take certain elements, man as an individual, man as a social being, and they overemphasize it to the denigration of these other elements. They don't maintain the synthesis. And what's really interesting, if we continue the Kierkegaardian analysis, if you don't maintain a synthesis, you as an individual, then ultimately you introduce a disrelationship within yourself and you're in despair. So if man is nothing but a collective being part of the hegemony, then you've lost his identity as an individual, unique person, specially created by God. That's a source of despair. If man is the individual monad isolated from society, that's a source of despair because now you've eliminated his communitarian aspect, that social dynamism, the need for community. You eliminate his body, then what's these drives, these needs of the body all about? Are they worthless? Is it something I can change? It's a source of despair.
Yeah, one is reminded of Aristotle's politikon, or that man is a political uh, being, and that he must be in the city. And if not, then he is either a god or a beast, right? From Aristotle's Politics.
Right.
But I'm also reminded, if I may, about Plato's, and I think this kind of ties into the earlier question that Guillermo posed, which is something like, how can we think about personalism with regard to these kind of other isms and or kind of the whole sort of political world, if you will? And it's funny because, first of all, when you read Plato's Republic, I mean, there's so many ways to discuss what's inside of the Republic. Most of the time, it's a discussion of what's the proper education, or what is how should we think about music and aesthetics and whatnot. But it's called the Republic, so there should be some serious political theory going on there, and in fact there is, but it's not clear to me just yet, and I'm on my maybe like third reading of the Republic. But it's something like this, that man's soul, because there is quite a lengthy discussion of the soul in the Republic, but that man's soul represents the city. So the city is a reflection of the soul of man. And you might think that, well, we know that the city is really just an aggregate. We know that a state or a society is really just an aggregate of individuals. But I think what's quite compelling here is the investigation of how a city, state, nation is a reflection of a soul. And I don't know if there's a kind of a personalist comment in there, but I do know that it's one of the earliest investigations to make sense of the city, or to make sense of any kind of political inquiry. You have to go back to the individual, and you have to go back to the soul.
Yeah. What you said there actually reminds me of Carol Wojtyła, because in his books, whether you look at Person and Act or Love and Responsibility, one of the main themes that he's going to drive on is actually one of the themes that you mentioned about the Republic. With the city state, you have all these different elements. You have the guardians, you have the workers. I forget the terms he uses because it's been a while since I read it, but you have these different classes with these different particular tasks. And when they all work in harmony, you have the flourishing city state. And when we use that as an analogy for the soul, to put aside the city state idea and think about the person in terms of how Wojtyła approaches it. The human person, you have the body, you have its drives, right? You have instinct, you have the psychological makeup of the person, you have the habits or vices, the virtues, you have his ability to know, knowledge, you have the will, you have the heart, the emotions. All of these elements need to be integrated in a life following Christ. There has to be an integration for that harmony of the person. Kind of like how for the Republic, you have to have that integration of soul to have the harmony of the city state. So there is certainly an analogy there, but there's also going to be, I think, a little bit of a flaw in thinking of with that analogy of city state.
Right. Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's great. I think just for lack of other words, concern that I have is, say a lot of us just aren't all that formed in the philosophical sciences. And I guess, where would be a good place to start, do you think, um, to get informed on personalism?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the book you mentioned by Juan Manuel Burgos, Introduction to Personalism, I think
Yeah.
that would be a great primer for someone to read because you get a kind of crash course into these different thinkers and what their goals and objectives were with personalism. That helps give you an idea of the general lay of the land, help you discern where do you want to go exploring.
Because they didn't all agree on everything.
That's true. Yeah.
And I guess one question I have, just regarding phenomenology and existentialism,
Mm-hmm.
what do their root words mean?
Right.
Yeah, and how are they related to personalism?
Right. So I would say existentialism is about the emphasis is on existence.
Mm,
I think it man's encounter with existence. Because whether you look at the absurdists, the nihilists, or the Christian inspired thinkers, they're all looking at man's situation in existence and they're trying to come to an understanding of that situation. Whether it's
interesting.
Nietzsche or Kierkegaard in the 19th century or 20th century, whether it's Heidegger, Sartre, or someone like Gabriel Marcel, you have this kind of struggle to try and understand the meaning of man's existence and the things he encounters. With phenomenology, that's something that we can trace its origin directly to Edmund Husserl with the publication of his book Logical Investigations in 1900. And the task of in that book, according to Husserl, for our phenomenology is going back to the things themselves. Because in the 1800s, idealism overtook German philosophy. You were either a Kantian, neo-Kantian, or some other brand of idealism. So Immanuel Kant started this big idealist movement. You had various thinkers like Fichte, and then there's Hegel and his brand, and of course others like Schelling. And so Husserl himself struggled a lot with some of these movements because there was a strong consensus during his time of believing in psychologism, which in for the philosophy of logic, that means that you believe that all of logic are just psychological constructs or psychological objects in some meaning. And Husserl himself believed this. And then he had kind of a turning moment when he was criticized heavily for that view by the German logician Frege. It's a scathing critique when Frege told Husserl that the moon must weigh heavily upon your mind in reference to psychologism, which I think is just hilarious. Because if it's just psychological, then yeah, the moon does weigh heavily upon your mind. But and so that made Husserl realize he had to break out of psychologism. He's like, we need to go back to the things themselves.
Yeah, it's funny, Jeremy. I think about the etymology of phenomenology and phenomena or phenomenon, which is something like from the Greek, what comes into being or what comes into appearance.
Yeah.
And so, and I think we've already talked about this, but my working definition for so long before reading Husserl was the study of the structures of experience. So the way we experience things.
Right. You mean more like an empirical description?
I think so. I find that Husserl's back to the things themselves is a lot easier to work with.
Yeah.
I think you sound really cool and you feel really like cool when you say, the study of the structures of experience.
Well, it's a rallying cry against idealism, because now
Right.
it's a claim of realism.
Right.
And
But I think
that's what inspired his early thinkers to flock to him.
Right.
And that's also a source for personalism, because now you have a realist philosophy that's going to investigate the person.
Mhm.
Though what is interesting about phenomenology is that it really has three different interpretations, and it's somewhat all due to Husserl. Because the early school took a Platonic view, because Husserl wants to take phenomenology to investigate essences. So what are these essences? Well, Husserl started out sounding very Platonic in the logical investigations, and that's how his early followers believed him. That's how someone like Dietrich von Hildebrand and Edith Stein interpreted Husserl. Then when Husserl published his book Ideas about 15 years later, if I recall correctly, well, then it looked like it was more of an idealist view. So the temptation of not resisting idealism was not sufficiently strong enough. Right? He caved into idealism. And his early followers criticized him heavily for becoming an idealist.
Now, an idealist is different than an ideologue, correct?
So, an idealist is someone who essentially believes that reality in some manner is part of one's psychological makeup. And that has various interpretations. So, like Kant said that if you think of the categories of metaphysics, he said that those were forms of the human mind. So that there are ways of how we think. So they don't have a direct relation to reality, but they're how our mind orders reality. So in that respect, Kant was an idealist.
Okay.
Um,
And an ideologue is someone, I think, that is imposing ideas on reality.
Ooh, that is a good way to put it.
Right. And so what I've been learning from Dietrich von Hildebrand was and maybe even from Husserl together, is to allow reality to open itself up to you.
right.
Don't try to impose anything on it. Right.
Yeah. There's this great chapter in Hildebrand's The Art of Living where you have to have an attitude of reverence in order to pretty much come into any value understanding. So to understand intellectual values, to understand truth, goodness, beauty, those all require a humility and reverence in order to be receptive.
Well, that was going to be the book that I was going to recommend it to Memo. Because you could take the approach of like, okay, well, let me sort of slow walk into personalism, or you could just dive into it, and that would be the art of living, because the art of living is something that's pragmatic, it's practical, right? You could practice this.
Right. We could also throw in Hildebrand's Transformation in Christ as another great one. That's his giant book on the virtues, but it's all inspired by living a Christian life. It's a very monumental work.
So I heard. And The Art of Living, the title itself does speak volumes.
Yeah, it's a great little book. I think it's only like 100 pages.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
super readable and super practical. I mean, you could get through the first chapter, and
that's cool.
if you're
I was kind of under the impression that no, if you want to get into philosophy, even if you wanted to read Descartes or Hume, you have to start with Plato and Aristotle. You can't not just get on board at a certain period of time and go from there. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I would say it really kind of depends on the thinker.
Okay. Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Some thinkers, like if you want to jump into St. Thomas Aquinas,
Oh,
you better have a good Aristotelian understanding. You
mm,
have to understand Aristotle's ethics, metaphysics, politics, etc.
wow. Holy smokes.
If you don't understand Aristotle, a lot of what St. Thomas says is not going to make sense. If you don't have a good theological understanding, a lot of what St. Thomas says won't make sense either.
Interesting.
One of my students is reading some excerpts of St. Thomas, and I have to explain theology and philosophy to him because he doesn't understand Aristotle or Catholic theology. He's like, "What's concupiscence?" He's like, "Well, this is what it is." Explain
Sure.
to him original sin.
Okay.
He didn't understand what original sin was. I was like, "Well, you can't understand his point until you understand all this teaching."
That is
When
amazing.
you read someone like Kierkegaard, you don't need to have a working knowledge of Hegel, but if you had a working knowledge of Hegel, you would understand some of Kierkegaard's criticisms. But on the other hand, a lot of his works you don't really need, doesn't even refer to Kierkegaard or refer to Hegel, and his works will bear much fruit. I'm thinking in particular his book, The Sickness Unto Death, which is his analysis of despair. It's a great book. And in it, he argues why everyone is in despair, because none of us are saints. Right.
And Memo, I might be a bit more rigid in my response, which is you need to read pre-Socratics. You need to read The Republic, and you need to read the Politics at the very least.
I don't know.
Wait a minute.
I'm thinking Martin Buber instead.
By pre-Socratics, you mean before Socrates, right?
Right. We're
Yeah.
talking.
No,
He's
but we're-
talking Thales.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Heraclitus.
I thought Plato and Aristotle were after Socrates.
Yeah. So you have Anaximander, Thales, Heraclitus,
Empedocles. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
that whole gang of
Yeah.
the first Greek philosophers.
Yeah.
Then you get Socrates roaming around Athens.
Okay. Okay. That was just
And
one concern I
I
had.
will say, right, then after Socrates, of course, you get Plato and Aristotle. But one interesting parallel is Kierkegaard was deeply influenced by Socrates in the Socratic method. And he would actually wander around Copenhagen talking to random people on the side of the street, and he would spend hours doing this.
Yeah.
In some ways, he was reliving life of Socrates.
Oh, remind me, who?
Kierkegaard.
Kierkegaard. Okay, I don't know why I thought
Yeah.
von Hildebrand.
No, Kierkegaard.
Oh, okay. Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
And one, just completely off topic. Are any of these individuals American?
I don't think I named any Americans.
No.
Are there good American philosophers?
That's what. Well, now there are, but
Well, actually,
Crosby,
what is
maybe.
really interesting.
his book is great.
Whose book?
Crosby.
Oh, yeah,
Crosby.
Dr. Crosby's.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he has two books, The Selfhood of the Human Person and The Personalist Papers. They're both really good.
Okay.
But yeah, there is actually an early school of personalism that I forget where they got their influence from. I forget who exactly, because it's been a while since I learned about this. But one of the professors at Boston College in the early 1900s was in Germany. I think it might have been through contact with Shaler or someone, the early phenomenological personalist trained to thought, and brought that back to the United States. And Borden Parker was one of these early thinkers of personalism. Though the American school at Boston College was more of an idealist view.
Mm.
So
All
you
right.
do have a American personalism early on, but I don't think it caught on quite as it didn't quite become a thing because we were mainly in the US were mainly dominated by the analytic
Right.
philosophy.
That's interesting.
And before the analytics, it was transcendentalism for a long time from Emerson
Mm.
in America, who Nietzsche was a huge fan of, by the way. Huge fan of Emerson, believe it or not. So,
Charles, can you share with us a little bit about who Nietzsche and Emerson are?
yeah, Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Oh,
Yeah. So,
oh,
one of the main poets. He wrote a book
okay.
called He wrote a lot of essays around the Cambridge, Massachusetts area, and was a poet, was an essayist, a literary figure, a tremendous influence on Henry David Thoreau, who wrote the book Walden. So a really kind of wooden figure of American philosophy, very individualist and sort of, I guess, deist. He wasn't really, I guess, more like the Unitarian Church, I think, is what he was a member of. But certainly Emerson and his idea of the oversoul, which is this kind of universal spirit, if you will, that man has, deeply influenced what would become the Übermensch in the Nietzschean or the Nietzschean system, which is the surpassing man. That man that Nietzsche is now ushering in the possibility for a man that overcomes good and evil, and that a man can overcome religious dogmatics and whatnot. Totally into the will to power, and the response, by the way, to modernity, right? I think we had mentioned we were going to use that word. I apologize, I'm using it, but modernity really is the negation of the eternal, right? So that there is no more transcendence. It's all about you, and I think that also kind of dovetails back a bit to the ideas of existentialism. But you could argue that Ralph Waldo Emerson was the first American existentialist.
But and then who was Nietzsche? And for whatever reason, I was thinking of Francis Bacon.
Oh yeah,
Totally different guy.
Very much so. Yeah. So Nietzsche was a German philosopher that lived from the mid 1800s to 1899. 1900, I think, is the year he passed. Probably one of the best classicists we've seen in the last couple hundred years. I mean, he held a chair. He held a chair in philosophy when he was 24 years old. He started as a philologist, so he was studying Greeks, mainly the playwrights, Aristophanes and Euripides and Sophocles and so on. But Nietzsche, you might have heard like the whole kind of God is dead thing, right? I mean, this is actually from the Frolicsome Science, or the Gay Science, which is one of his texts, which is really a report of what he's seeing happening in Europe. So Nietzsche is reporting on the death of God. He's not prophesying. He's reporting that, you know what? Guess what? God's dead because of the rise of modernism and the rise of the power of science and the power of rationalism and the power of the Enlightenment, let's say. So he's only reporting on that, and he's not a nihilist, because he's saying, okay, well, if this is the case and God really is dead and therefore metaphysics is dead or something, what are we to do? And so his resolution was that man has to somehow become this oversoul, become this Übermensch, become a surpassing man. So it is kind of sort of self-idolatry, if you will. I mean, you literally become God. You have to become God to respond to the death of God, right? So
yeah.
But what if we don't?
It's interesting, Charles, is Kierkegaard too, on that same regard, because both Nietzsche and Kierkegaard looked at 19th century Europe and saw how essentially you have all these Christians behaving as if God is dead. And as Nietzsche said, they're not moved, they're not batting an eye, right? They're indifferent. That indifference, Kierkegaard took his own unique approach. And part of his goal of his writings was for the reader to come to despair over the fact that he is indifferent towards religion and to try and bring the person to that despairing encounter with himself to make him realize, yes, he needs God and to
Right.
take that act of faith.
Mhm.
So, two very different approaches to the same problem. And I think really it's also a problem that continued to this day, that indifference about religious matters.
That's absolutely right. I should also mention that Nietzsche started out by wanting to study theology,
Yes.
but was just someone that, for whatever reason, the Lutheranism at the time in which he found himself wasn't good enough for him. It wasn't deep enough for him. I will say that there is evidence in his Nachlass, which is his letters that I've been able to look at and think about, where he does, in fact, hold a very high regard for the mystery of the Eucharist, believe it or not.
Now that's
So,
interesting.
yeah. So,
Yeah, that's one of those things I have not heard of before.
yeah. Well, keep talking to me and you'll hear a lot more that you haven't heard before. So,
Maybe you should write an article
that's right.
on the mystery of the Eucharist.
You know what? Yep. Okay. Let's do it.
That I'm sure will make people scratch their heads.
Well, yeah, because just another thing that came to my mind, and maybe I was misinformed, was he not influential to Adolf Hitler?
Yeah, to some extent, I would say.
It might be fair, but it might be unfair to say that he's a sort of proto-fascist or a kind of proto-Nazi. It is the case, though, that his when he was kind of in the last years of his life, he was in convalescence and was just a living vegetable, basically. But his sister started taking all of his works and publishing them and whatnot, and she was a heavy anti-Semite.
Oh,
And it's also the case that if I'm not mistaken, that the Nazis were reading some of his works and thinking about how they can empower the German spirit. But I don't think he was intentionally. He wasn't like intentionally writing to be a nationalist. In fact, he looked down on politics, right? I mean, he's the guy that. Yeah, he's the guy that said, "Hey, look, philosophy is the ultimate thing, right? Music is the ultimate thing, and we need to walk up this mountain of truth. And when we get up here, we're gonna be lonely and we're gonna be alone, but we're looking down on the rest of the world, and that's just, he wasn't politically inclined, to say the least. Yeah,
I think that's accurate. Charles, is it's kind of a yes and no answer. Yes, you find Nietzschean themes in Hitler, but no, because there are themes in Nietzsche that are contradict what Hitler went out to do. It's also kind of like how Hitler took inspiration from some works of Martin Luther, because Luther had some anti-Semitic works also, but that doesn't mean Martin Luther's a proto-Hitler type person. No.
then no, and then of course Hitler borrowed from a lot of people, even the Quran. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, Hitler, I think, was just trying to use whatever he could from the German intellectual climate in order to persuade the masses to his ideology, because he'll appeal to Darwin, Luther, Nietzsche, and others.
And East Indian Vedic symbolism and mystery sort of schools.
Yeah, there's a whole occult element too, because he was part of some very freakish, weird occult thing. and that's its own. So,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All
I mean,
right.
he's just a weird dude.
Well, you brought it up,
and-
Memo. So.
Yeah, you brought up. We're just going to find out he's just a weird dude.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough.
Pray for his soul.
Though. Okay. And of course,
Yeah.
just another thing that came to mind, because we're talking about Kierkegaard, Hildebrand, a lot of these individuals. My question is, what would a lot of them say in light of the ideologies that we're facing now? Are they that much different than what they were up against?
I think it's kind of a yes and no, because today you have new situations like the
Okay.
LGBT movement.
Okay,
That's a new
good point.
phenomenon,
Oh, of course.
but that doesn't mean we don't have the resources of personalism to address that, for example. Because one thing the LGBT movement does is rejects the unity of the person as a body soul unity. The human body has nothing to do with your identity, according to these thinkers. Whereas if you want to call yourself a personalist, you have to assert that fundamental unity, body, soul, that relationship. That means there is something deeply informative of your identity as a result of your body. And that's precisely what they want to reject.
Interesting. No, and of course I do talk about the integral view of the human person, and I was thinking overwhelmingly in terms of personality and possibly the soul, but of course we are embodied spirits, so personalism absolutely takes into account the human body.
Yeah. And we could also just think about some of the political climate today,
Yes.
where you have, say, in the United States, you have people, they're not dialoguing with each other. They're just name calling, shouting
Yeah.
insults and shouting down each other. And that's a anti-personalist attitude towards other people, because your concern is not the other person. It's not about respecting other people. It's about belittling them to advance your own ideology, your own propaganda. And propaganda itself is fundamentally an anti-personalistic take of education, because you're not trying to convict people of the truth. You're trying to force something upon them. And that's why you have the mass incarcerations of populations in China. Because propaganda. It's why you have the culture wars in the United States and why people can barely talk to each other. It's propaganda.
That's
They're
terrible.
not taking into account the fact that each person is a unique individual being whom demands our respect. And we should say with their reverence, right? Each personal being is a special kind of being to which there's a proper reverence. And I apologize if you hear children screaming in the background, but that's the nature of toddlers at bedtime.
Hey, Jeremy, I want to throw in just a shameless plug one more time, because this guy, this was the only book where I had to actually pull the car over and like stop driving and just sit down in an empty parking lot and think about it. And you already mentioned it earlier, Martin Buber's I and Thou.
Yes.
Ich und du. Okay. And for me, for my money, no one has done this better to think about another person when you're talking to them, when you're experiencing them, when you're having a discussion. You're in front of the other. You're in front of another being that is so much, just as fundamentally important as you are, just as you would be praying to God, let's say. That kind of divine moment of just the dialogue and the miracle of communication. Let me say it like that. That communication with another person is miraculous. And what Martin Buber does for me, and I think this is just for listeners out there that are trying to maybe make sense of these kind of political tensions and stressors and whatnot. This really is just a fundamental problem of the lack of communication. We don't know how to commune with one another. And Martin Buber wrote this book, I and Thou, and I think everyone should read it. It's a fairly short text. I mean, it's like what, maybe 200 pages, 175 pages,
it's,
something?
It's like 100 some pages. I don't know.
Yeah.
I got it right here. I can pull it out.
Yeah. It is the kind of book, and I think it's just right in line with what we're saying, that in terms of personalism and the dignity of the humans, a human being, Martin Buber, this Jewish philosopher, is, and this book has changed psychology as we know it. I mean, in terms of the way we communicate and the way we commune with one another, and just to recognize the absolute fundamental dignity of the other person. It is such an important text, and I just wanted to get on my soapbox real quick.
It is one of those books I'd highly recommend anyone interested in personalism. It is 130 pages. If you're wondering what book to or what translation, get the Walter Kaufmann translation. Walter Kaufmann, interestingly enough, was also a famous Nietzsche scholar who translated several of Nietzsche's works.
Right.
And it's actually some of Buber's work that I was thinking of in my head when I made my comments about propaganda versus education. Because that, in order to understand those two paradigms, you have to first understand the difference between treating other people as thous versus its, entering into a relation with them where you treat them only as a I-it relation or versus a I-thou relation. Education presupposes a I-thou relationship with the other person, where you take into account the radical preciousness of the other and you try and act as a midwife to birth the truth in them. Whereas propaganda, the other person is an it for the means of you to distribute your ideology. You have undercut their personal being and you manipulate that personal being for your own aims.
Absolutely.
Charles, you mentioned the one word that I wanted to mention in light of what Jeremy had shared about due respect. That's not what you said, Jeremy, word for word, but something along those lines. Charles, you mentioned dignity. As I was looking into today's topic, it really stood out to me that personalism regards the dignity of the human person.
Exactly.
Yeah, and disturbingly enough, off topic, but it does have to do with last week's topic. I was informed that, and maybe this one SSPX advocate doesn't speak for SSPX, but he said that there is no dignity apart from Christ. And I figured no one in their right mind would think it's somehow less evil to kill a non-Catholic than it is to kill a Catholic. It's just equally evil.
Right.
In a way that yeah, just rationally in a sadistic way, but
yeah, I do feel like you need to be careful there, Guillermo, because when we talk about dignity, you can take it two different ways theologically. And that distinction, a lot of people I don't think really take, because on one hand, there is that fundamental dignity of each and every individual human person as being made in the image and likeness of God. And that cannot be denigrated. On the other hand, there is a kind of dignity that you lose through sin, right? You don't lose this ontological dignity. as being imago Dei, but you lose something of yourself when you sin. And most importantly, if you don't repent and are damned for your mortal sins, if you're unrepentant and you choose to rebel against God forever, you lose something of your dignity. And so you have two interconnected but different meanings of dignity, where
Okay.
one, you do have this one meaning that only comes to fruition through a moral life in Christ. So you have one sense of dignity that's theologically ordered to Christ, but you still have this fundamental dignity that's ontological, the dignity of the human person. And you find both meanings in church teaching, interestingly enough.
Awesome. Okay. No, well, thank you for that clarification on how we use the word dignity.
Yeah. And one
If I
thing,
can say one thing real quick, Jeremy, if I
Yeah, of
can.
course.
Pico della Mirandola wrote a book called, if I'm not mistaken, that On the Dignity of Man. And some credit him as being the founder of the humanities, and that he was a Renaissance writer. He lived during the time of Savonarola. I think you guys may have heard of him before, Savonarola. But I think Jeremy's right that we need to be sort of cautious when we think about what it is true that everyone has dignity because we're made in the image of God. But once you realize that, then the dignity becomes even that much more sort of grave. Let's say it becomes that much more serious. Like, okay, you know what I
Okay.
mean?
Yeah. Okay, that does help.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I do want to point out that there is a little bit of confusion today within some Catholics concerning that distinction I made. Like when we look at some of the radical traditionalists like Marcel Lefebvre, I don't think he's quite clear on that. Make some statements that seem like that you can lose your ontological dignity.
He said that?
There are some statements that to me
Ugh.
make it appear that you can lose your ontological dignity. And that could be the source for concern because in
Yeah.
reference to the individual you were just talking about. I did want to mention that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm looking in this book here, see if I can find some references concerning the two meanings of dignity.
Wait, who said that? Jeremy Lefebvre?
Yeah, Marcel Lefebvre, I'm pretty
Mhm.
sure.
Well, the reason why I ask about our day and age is because of everything we're going through. There's this disintegrated view of the human person in the sense that we just don't have an accurate view of the dignity that the human person has.
Right. And that's what makes it so important to have a clear conception of who is man.
Yeah, and I would say that in terms of the kind of political ramifications of, let's say, an age where nothing is sacred anymore,
Mm,
then as we've seen in history, the rise of projects that see humans as fundamental objects and its, as Jeremy alluded to earlier, like instead of a thou, instead of approaching the human as a thou, it's easy to approach a human as an it, an object. And insofar as humans are objectified, and I apologize up front for using sort of Marxist terminology, but insofar as humans can be objectified, then they become widgets that are in the sort of political machine of a state to do the will of the machine, right? And Heidegger talks quite a bit about this in his later lectures, but yeah, for what it's worth, I mean, what happens is when you can erase or annihilate the sacred, then everything is sort of just an object, including humans, to be nothing more than just widgets doing the will of the machine state, let's say. And this is only exacerbated by a technocracy. So by a state that is technocratic, where the technology now is running everything.
Yeah.
I
Just
see.
just to divert our conversation for a moment, if anyone was interested, the distinction I was talking about was the distinction between operative and ontological dignity, and I actually do talk about that in Marcel, and I should say, or Marcel Lefebvre, in my commentary on Dignitas Humanae, part 4, because that is one of the objections Lefebvre will make against the Vatican II document. So if you're interested in looking at further, that's a place to look into the topic.
Nice.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Well, okay, we see how this philosophy is necessary. One question I had is it quote unquote modernist?
Is what modernist?
Personalism.
Well, that's going to be depend on what do you mean by modernist.
Okay, yeah. No, and we should dedicate that for a set, just because no, we could dedicate at least a whole hour to modernism.
Yeah.
So, okay,
I
no,
think the key thing to keep in mind is some people will say yes because they have a knee-jerk reaction to
no,
anything modern. So as
But-
soon as you say phenomenology or existentialism, they say modernist because it's modern.
no,
And you have a lot of crazy thinkers.
yes, no, but as the analogy that I said last time, just as leftists say that everything is racist, they find racism even where it isn't. Well, same thing with ratrads and how they use the word modernist. Everything's modernist to the point where
Oh, yeah.
they don't know what they're saying, and there's that
Yeah.
misconception. If it's modern, quote unquote, then it's modernist, and that's just not accurate. That was, but you did kind of answer my question in that regard. And
Yeah,
no,
Memo, that's a whole nother series. I
Hell
mean,
yeah.
it's like because modernity has been studied, and I could bring in some like Straussian ideas about the waves of modernity, that the 3 waves were Descartes, Rousseau, and Nietzsche. And now we're in the kind of late stage of that.
oh, okay.
But right, but that's only one way to think about it. I mean, modernity sort of just reflects the break between the kind of Middle Ages, let's say, and rationalism, right? And so
Gotcha.
we're shifting from God and the transcendent, where metaphysics is real, to the vacuum of just human experience, where there is no more God and no more transcendence. But
Yeah.
I think it's important to slowly walk through that, so that we could see the developments as a kind of unfolding in the history of thought, let's say. And I think that'd be really good for everyone, right? Just to kind of see the kind of the unfolding of where we're at today,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But that's a whole nother series. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. Guillermo, I think you have a important question to ask concerning personalism.
Is it in Vatican II?
I was having a conversation with Dr. Crosby, John F. Crosby, who we talked about earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and it was about actually Dietrich von Hildebrand, because you have this weird contradiction with radical traditionalists, where on the one hand, they hate Vatican II and they hate modern things, or a lot of modern things, And you have Hildebrand, who's a phenomenologist, who some of his teaching actually did inspire some of the teachings in Gaudium et Spes, the Vatican II document, and yet they cite Hildebrand in some of their criticisms of modernity. So when I was talking to Dr. Crosby about this problem, because a lot of the books that the radical traditionalists refer to are no longer in print and some are ridiculously expensive. One thing that he and I both agreed on was that Vatican II is deeply a personalist council.
Mhm. You know, just one analogy that I provide, and you guys can correct me if I'm off, that just as metaphysics is necessary for the proofs for the existence of God and for understanding the sacraments, this philosophy, personalism, is necessary for understanding the human person. So what if it's not theological in and of itself?
I don't
Is
know
it
what you mean by that. I
um
mean, the theology of body would say otherwise to me.
what do you mean?
Well, personalism is not strictly a philosophy or strictly a theology. It's both, I would say, if you do it properly. If you
Okay.
read the works of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, it is a deeply theological and philosophical work. The perspective of personalism is deeply influenced by Christian revelation. That's a deeply theological source. When we would talk about Vatican II,
Mm,
its purpose is, of course, the renewal of the church, right?
yep.
That's a deeply theological concern, but how it does it is a very personalistic manner. It does it in a very personalistic manner. One of the aims that John the 23rd mentions is that he wants to use the medicine of mercy. You have to distinguish between error and the person in error. You condemn the error, but not like the person in error.
Great.
So you have this personalistic attitude from the very beginning, right? That using this medicine of mercy, Vatican II very purposefully did not produce any anathemas. You look at the church documents, there's the theme in many ways is the person, man. And that's one of the objections radical traditionalists make against Vatican II is, oh, it's all about man, man, man. I was like, of course, because
Yeah,
that's who
sure.
it is that needs to be reformed and to return to Christ. It's the human person.
I think that was my more along the lines of my objection to their objection. So I guess, well, yeah, not that it's not theological, but it's coming from a certain angle that it's different, but it's
Yeah,
true.
right. It's the radical traditionalists want a return to neo-scholasticism,
Mm,
and that's just something the Vatican II fathers said no. The very first debates in the council, in some respect, were a debate as to how they were going to do theology, the neo-scholastic way or a different way. And when you look at the debates, it was a rejection of the kind of neo-scholastic manualist method of doing theology. The preparatory documents that were made in preparation for Vatican II were all done in this neo-scholastic manner, manual, very technical theological terminology. And the council fathers in the first session of the council rejected the document, said, no, we're going to start from scratch. And so what ended up happening is you get some of these documents get revised heavily with these kind of personalistic themes. And you have new themes that are taken up, like religious freedom, dignitatis humanae. Man has a right to religious freedom. And the inspiration for that is the truth of who is man as a truth
Sure.
seeker.
Exactly.
So you
Yeah.
get this personalist revolution, but in a good sense, as a reform and renewal of theology.
And I'm really taking this as a deeper understanding. This isn't contradicting what has been revealed by Christ, what has been handed on, basically.
Right. So let's take no salvation outside the church as a perfect example of the kind of personalist. The radical traditionalist will see something like the Council of Florence statement that even Jews, schismatics, heretics, etc., they're not saved. And they'll say, see, Vatican II contradiction. But what they don't pay attention to is the development in the teachings about how, when you look at St. Robert Bellarmine, Francisco Suarez, and others, just through the centuries, how you get several very subtle distinctions in theology. And in the end, while maintaining there is no salvation outside the church, you can also talk about the invincible ignorance of some people.
Yep.
How they could still be saved, even though they never actually joined the Catholic Church on earth as a physical member. And unpacking that really required a confrontation of theologians over a course of several centuries to meditate upon the human person and historical circumstances, such as, for example, the discovery of the Americas. Millions of people had never heard Jesus. And so the human person has played a large role in our development, just understanding no salvation outside the church. And to the interested audience, that the historical development of that teaching is a forthcoming essay for the website in preparation for a commentary on Nostra Aetate.
Wonderful. All right. So we addressed personalism, and I do want to ask if either of you have any other thoughts, comments, and so forth.
I read something recently, and I need correction if this is not right. But I read something from I think it was Ratzinger that was something like this: that conscience is one's conscience could be above the magisterium. Is that right?
I don't.
Could you cite that?
Yeah, I don't know about that.
I'll have to cite it, but what I'm wondering is this, and I don't know if this is a question that radical traditionalists would think about or something, but in terms of where we're at in our age with questionable kind of developments in civilization, let's say, that the conscience is something that could be, in fact, and I think this ties into the human person. That if in fact your conscience is, I don't know what the word would be, something like, if the conscience contradicts the magisterium, or let me even say like something like the Pope. If the conscience, if your conscience contradicts the Pope, like just go with your conscience. If you're a Catholic, have you heard something like this before? It's choppy.
But that's condemned, Charles. You can't believe that and be Catholic.
Okay, but this is, I've seen this strain of thought around sort of different websites.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I've seen this around.
Yeah, no, it's been condemned.
Coming from who?
Most recently, that I can think of is Donum Veritatis by the CDF. It's on the vocation of the theologian.
Hmm.
We look at paragraph 28, for example. It specifically says that one cannot use conscience to justify dissent. It says here, well,
Okay.
nor furthermore would the judgment of the subjective conscience of the theologian justify it, because conscience does not constitute an autonomous and exclusive authority for deciding the truth of a doctrine. So you cannot disagree with the church on grounds of conscience.
Okay.
The church specifically rejects that view. And I'm sure I can find some more quotes here if I open up Denzinger.
I think what you're sharing, Charles, is an abuse of the importance of conscience,
Not just that, but it's a abuse
or
of
a distortion.
understanding authority. Because what you're doing is putting your conscience above church authority. And if you're going to be Catholic, you submit to the authority of the church. That's what it means to be Catholic, is that you accept the governance of the church. And if you don't accept the governance of the church, then you by definition are not a Catholic. And one could easily cite St. Robert Bellarmine or Lumen Gentium. You have, in order to be Catholic, you have to accept the authority of the church.
Good.
Because I think just as someone can argue that my conscience tells me that two people who love each other should be together in reference to LGBTQ, someone could say, yeah, my conscience told me to not celebrate the Novus Ordo, so I'm out.
Yeah. And that's actually a real question that I had, because I don't know where I saw this, but I saw this sort of claim on some website.
It's a distortion or an abuse. No,
Okay.
that's
good.
okay. No, you're good.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to look up something right here.
Mhm.
Let's see here. If it is what I'm thinking of, it's also a very interesting quote. Let's see here. Yeah, another interesting error that the church condemns actually in 1835. Gregory the 16th. There's a individual the theology professor George Hermes at Munster, who held that one can use doubt for theological inquiry, and that is a condemned view.
Huh.
Yeah, so you can't use doubt as a theological method. So if you want to try, say, doubt a pope or ecumenical council, well, you cannot do that either. Or, yeah.
And doubt in that context is the same thing as skepticism.
That's an interesting question.
I would say I'm inclined to say no, just because, in my opinion, doubt is more like we're assuming
It's not true.
that it's not true, whereas skeptic is just like, I find it hard to believe.
Yeah, I think that's a good general distinction.
Yeah. And what came to my mind is hermeneutic, because I know in biblical foundations we talked about hermeneutic of doubt, and that's just different than a hermeneutic of rupture, which we've been addressing.
Right.
Correct.
Well, a hermeneutic of doubt can still lead to skepticism.
Sure.
Right. Doubt and skepticism are very interrelated.
Yeah. All right. And just one of the things that I wanted to conclude with was suggesting sources for personalism. So we already talked about von Hildebrand. We already talked about Martin Buber's I and Thou. Let's check those out. And the only personalist I read, I guess besides Dr. Crosby, was Jacques Maritain's The Person and the Common Good. What I will say about this book, because I went to public school my whole life up until graduate school, from high school throughout my 6 or so years as an undergraduate, I was just really led to believe, I would argue brainwashed, to think that socialism, it's not a bad thing in and of itself. It's just an easily corruptible uh, method of politics and economics. I read this 100 or so page book, and it convinced me overnight that socialism is pure evil. I urgently recommend this book.
Which book is this again, Memo?
It's called The Person and the Common Good by Jacques Maritain.
Okay.
Yes.
Nice.
And is it personalistic? I would say so. There's if I recall correctly, there's some Thomistic elements to it.
Well, Maritain was a Thomist.
Yeah.
Of his
Oh.
own brand.
Okay.
I would say.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's just one source I wanted to throw out there. It's a short book, powerful.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, his work was also influential in Vatican II.
Is that right?
Yeah, his book, Integral Humanism, was a inspirational work for several of the bishops at the council and Pope Paul VI.
Okay. Awesome. All right. Do we have any prayer requests before we conclude?
I would like the prayer request for Ukraine and Russia.
Okay.
And of course, if we want to keep thinking politically, all the human rights abuses in China.
Okay.
And of course, we had the recent passage of abortion in Colombia. Yeah. So throughout the world, we are facing crises of different sorts, all that which are opposed to the human person.
Yeah, absolutely.
My one request would be for my wife. She's pregnant again.
Hey,
So, number 5. And
number 5. All right.
Congratulations.
yeah, we're keeping the party going. So yeah, please
All
pray
right.
for her and her health.
All right.
Thank you.
For people to have that I thou relation with.
That's right.
And for myself, real quick, for sure, for my grandfather, who I think is in his last days. Yeah, for mercy on his soul and
Yeah.
yeah, for his ultimately for his eternal rest.
Yeah.
But when it comes.
Yes.
All right, everyone. And that's it for today. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in.
Thanks.
We bid you adieu.
Goodbye.
God bless.